fascinating talk. We have a group here who's been working on looking at second language acquisition from an evolutionary perspective, and assuming that for adult second language learners, there's no biological mechanism that will guarantee it. You get a lot of variation. And one way to look at that problem is say, what has our species done to work around this problem?
Mm-hmm.
When populations come together, adults have to communicate in a language that will be difficult for them to learn. It'll take a long time. And there are a couple of things that happen in our history. One is the development of lingua francas.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a long history of that. I mean, Persian, Greek, Phoenician, English, for example. And what this does for a large population reduces the second language learning burden to one language.
Yeah.
And then there's the development of Sprachbunds, or aerial languages, such as might be illustrated in the Balkans, where we once called it Serbo-Croatian, but it was, it's where languages and communities live in equilibrium for a long period of time, and the languages converge.
Yeah.
So that when you move into a new area, you can learn the language rather quickly because it's quite like your own. Another way we seem to have handled it as a species is to simplify the target language. A good example of that is English also. When the Vikings came into the areas where speakers were speakers of Old English, there was massive simplification, not just in morphology, but in syntax as well. Same thing happened to Persian, same thing happened to Mandarin, same thing happened to Malay.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a lot of these languages now that have been skeletonized and underspecified, and makes them easier to learn by adults, or that's at least the hypothesis. Another way to handle the problem is to shift the language learning burden to children who are equipped to do it anyway.
Yeah.
It seems to me that's the solution you've landed upon.
Well, let's say that's the solution in the lack of the model to pick up all the other solutions you have mentioned. It is the solutions, yes, the model concluded on, but also, to be honest, the model cannot pick up on all the other solutions you mentioned.
Sure.
Because
I mean, every society does these differently.
Exactly. So what we have here is that we don't let language evolve. So basically it's a fixed cultural trait. What is of course a disadvantage, I completely agree that every language context situation probably leaves traces in the language. However, that's how it's conceptualized here. And what comes out is that you can actually forget about the adult population. If you ensure that young people learn it, that's the key to it. You almost can forget about second language acquisition in adults. What you need to target is the young generation. And also you have to keep the young generation speaking this language. I think it's a wonderful example in what happened in Wales. They, for many reasons, that is a much better case for maintaining the language. First of all, Welsh was spoken almost by the whole country. They started with their intervention strategies, I think, in the early 1970s, when numbers were not that low. And they managed to survive Welsh to an extent that we now see an increase in the bilingual population. And how they did it was, well, they made Welsh actually a fun language. You have rock bands singing in Welsh, you have these tabloid magazines in Welsh. So it is a medium for the young generation where they can communicate with, and also where they actually, what they are proud of. They are proud of speaking Welsh, and that's something they managed to do. And well, that's something that comes clearly out of the model. Kind of focus on the young ones, forget about the old ones.
I mean, it's a nice illustration of language being a cultural artifact. And
yeah.
As the culture changes, as the culture begins to promote it, then different acquisition patterns can take place. So
yeah, definitely.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Yeah, continuing actually on that same topic, I wanted to ask how, the importance of prestige, for say this of the language. how it plays out in your model and if you should model it differently. I'm not sure exactly how it appears in the model, but the reason I'm asking is, it seems to me, so I work in a language context area in South America where there's a majority and minority language bumping up against each other, and you see what's happening at the margin is a typical language loss type of thing. That seems to me is largely driven by not the availability of the language to be spoken.
Yes, okay.
It's driven by the coolness factor that you identified. I mean, I see it largely that way, that it's not that parents aren't teaching their kids the language, it's that it's stigmatized. And so the children grow up in a household where they could speak it, there's plenty of opportunities to speak it.
But they won't.
But it's just not as, to me it seems like a big factor in that is the influx of things like television, where they don't see anybody on television speaking Schwa, they only see people speaking Spanish.
Yeah.
Is there a way to, in your models, I wonder what would happen if you made the status, and I don't know if this is true of your models, but the prestige factor be also have population structure, such that it was a neighbor-neighbor interaction type of thing, right? So,
I see, yes.
Because it seems to me like right at this boundary zone,
Yeah.
the kids are growing up in a place where they see that there's a majority culture.
Yeah.
They actually go to school.
Yeah,
If they get into high school, they're going to high school with a lot of monolingual Spanish speakers, and they're embarrassed to speak their own language.
Yeah.
I think this happens in Los Angeles too, right? You have to go that far to see it. But I imagine the dynamics could be quite different if there's a nearest neighbor type of phenomenon affecting what's perceived as prestigious, as opposed to across the entire environment. Is that built into the models, or is there a way to model that?
Let's say that way. It's not nothing what I present today, but at the moment I'm working on a new project which tries to look at immigrant populations. So for instance, I lived before in London, and one of the biggest immigrant populations in London is a Polish-speaking community. And what's always quite striking is that these the Polish speaker, they stick very much together. So they are all in North London, very much concentrated. If you go in that areas, you find actually travel agencies, kind of food stores, everything else, just in Polish. There's no English anymore. But also there's, for those people, there's almost no incentive to learn English, just because they have reached a critical size where they can maintain their own culture, their own language, without actually learning the different language. And that's something probably that relates pretty much to what you're saying. And the answer is yes, you can. With the second category of models, these kind of discrete agent-based simulations, and it has a huge effect. If you have these local kind of local clustering or local differences, it will affect the language shift in probably unexpected ways, or something you might not be able to predict.
Is there, my only follow-up question then is there a way, because that seems, if that's the main way to avoid language loss, it's a bit depressing, because it implies that we all need to self-sort and live with people that are like us.
No.
So, I mean, which, right, it's intuitively, it seems right that if you live in neighborhoods of similar language speakers, that's the way to help with language. But do you have recommendations for policies that don't? Is there anything that comes out of the models that gives us hope other than things like that? Well,
I think what comes a little bit out of it is that, language is so tied to cultural identity. So, and going back to this diglossia effect, there's probably no way around that you speak, let's say at work, English. However, if you are so tied to your culture and think, I want to express my cultural identity also by my language, so that's why I'm speaking it at home, and therefore I transmit it to my kids. I think this notion of cultural identity and language being one of the strongest markers of cultural identity is a very strong one. And going back to the Scottish example, it is for me striking why the government is actually promoting Gaelic and not Scots. Scots are still spoken by 30% of the population. However, Scots is pretty much similar to English. People say it's an old English dialect or something like that. So you can actually understand Scots, at least if you're a native English speaker. I can't. So, and that of course it is too close to English. So if you want to express your own Scottish identity, and I mean, it's very interesting in the UK, actually Scotland, Wales, Ireland, how much they actually hate the English. And kind of expressing your own identity of being Scottish, then actually Gaelic serves this purpose so much better because it's so much more distinct from English. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see it picking up kind of in the notion, or together in the notion of cultural identity.
The Scots dialect is certainly understandable by English, but English people. But there is a place where there is an intermingling of Scots, English and Gaelic, which is completely incomprehensible to anybody except the locals. This is Newcastle, where we English call them Novocastrians, and they call themselves Geordies.
Mm-hmm.
And I well remember being in a boarding house where a Geordie insisted on listening to a half-hour programme which was completely incomprehensible for the next 30 minutes to us from the BBC. It began by saying, "And now the BBC presents Hiya Geordie," and from that moment on we haven't got a clue what was happening. But if I may, I'd like to make a comment about some other things. I myself descended from two lots of people, both of whom regarded their language as having very high status. The British and the Irish. The Irish kings and trace their ancestry back to Adam and Eve.
Mm-hmm.
They've got very careful genealogies going all the way down, and there's still some people living who can trace their unbroken genealogy all the way back, they say. You know, this managed these two languages managed to persist very well. Now, admittedly, you could get a political advantage, as my great-great-great-grandfather did, by marrying into the English ascendancy, which allowed him to practice law within the Pale. But outside, although the English dominated the entire island, nonetheless, there was no way that they were going to get rid of the Irish language because people were so proud of it. And elsewhere in Great Britain, you've got a similar sort of thing. The Welsh, for instance, kept their language because they're so proud of the poetry that the Druids at first were singing. But there's one other thing which kind of puzzles me, and that is you showed that in the Western Isles, the Gaelic persists.
Mm-hmm.
And as I see it, they were able to do this because they were isolated. They had great economic advantage in that they could produce the tweed, Harris tweed, and so you know other people had to learn how to talk to them to get stuff. And you had a very similar situation, it seems to me, in Cornwall.
Mm-hmm.
Admittedly, King Arthur set up his castle at Tintagel, but it was, I strongly believe, Cornish speakers who were mining the tin. That was one monopoly, and the other monopoly they had was China clay. And yet, the last Cornish speaker died in the 1700s, and I'm just wondering why the Cornish lost out, but the Western Isles managed to persist.
Well, why the Cornish lost out, I'm not quite can tell you, but I think they were, first of all, pretty much small, kind of isolated in these, what is it, down there in the UK, it's the southwest corner. But I think what's interesting also about Scottish Gaelic is or what might be helpful for persisting on those isles. So one of the main industry is fishing, and one of the peculiarities of the Gaelic language is that they have apparently 100 different words for seaweed. We just have one, seaweed. But if you are a fisherman, apparently it is incredibly important to know all these 100 different sorts of seaweed, because that gives you an advantage of where to go and fish. So especially in the old days, where there were a lot of fishermen on the coast, actually speaking Gaelic, which could distinguish between all those sorts of seaweed, gave you an advantage, because you could tell, like, well, that's kind of, I don't know, brown seaweed, and that's green, and there's those fish, and today that might be helpful here. However, fishing industry is vanishing, or it's changing, technology is changing, so they don't go out in their small boats anymore. They go out in these big fishing boats where they don't care about seaweed anymore. So actually the Gaelic language loses out on another niche, kind of, which gave them actually some advantage in kind of being able to pinpoint, well, that's a good spot because I see weed X or something, and it's just not useful anymore. So to answer your question, the persistence, I think, in these Western islands is exactly as you described. They are pretty much isolated. The economic pressure there is not that much or that big, actually, to shift towards English, because there is still business to be done in Gaelic. Gaelic might give you actually an advantage when you are a little fisherman, but I personally, just if you see, it will probably also become at some point a bilingual area with no monolingual a Gaelic speaker. That's
when you try to have this mathematical model for the equilibrium, and this equilibrium can be influenced dramatically so frequently by political edict or fiat, mandating one language to be expressed or another to be extinct. I mean, even for instance, if Scotland votes to secede from the UK, might that not have some dramatic
that has dramatic effects.
Choice?
So what I showed you is was the equilibrium for assuming the environment stays as it is. So however, I mean, what we all see with these interventions, we have changing environments. So actually what we need to do in order to keep up with those is to allow for parameters which change in time. So what you just suggested, if, let's say, Scotland became independent, and of course they would push much harder for Gaelic as the, let's say, state language or something like that, of course that's nothing the model can pick up in its present configuration. But if we allow for certain flexibility, if we allow for certain kind of temporal dependency of parameters such as status, then we can kind of include it. But your comment is very valid. The equilibrium is only for situation where the environment doesn't change over time.
Two quick things. First, can you comment on how you treated the status variable?
Yes, I
Like,
can.
is it just high and low, or is it some like, can you talk about how you did that in the model?
Well, it's actually pretty simple. The status is a continuum from 0 to 1. 1 meaning it's the highest status you can ever get. 0 is meaning, well, there is basically no status whatsoever. So here in the example between Gaelic and English, we basically had them relative to each other. If English were 0.7, Scottish were 0.3. So the status is basically a relative value of the benefit in relation to the other language. That's how it was modeled.
Okay. So, okay, I have a follow-up with that. So how high does your model predict how high status would have to be for Gaelic in order to offset the 860 people needed to, like, so it's a factor, right? So
yes. So
but how did?
Okay, the status is not changed in the model because it is. So the 860 are estimated on the current set of parameters. So we have a status difference where English is a high status and Gaelic is a low status language. So in order to come this disadvantage, you need speakers, to learn Gaelic to overcome this disadvantage. That, of course, that is a dynamic process. That the more speakers learn Gaelic, the more it's spoken, and of course the might be the lower the difference between two languages becomes, that is also clear. But the 860 is based on basically the status setup we have at the moment, which is in rough relations. I think it is estimated that Gaelic, English has 0.7, I think 2, and then Gaelic has 0.28 as a status variable. Does it make sense?
Yeah, I'm just curious how you arrive. That's a weird number to arrive at. So.
Okay.
It's just-
Let's spend a minute on perhaps explaining how we estimated the parameter, because that's basically, I think, the bottom of your question. So it's a model with actually a lot of parameters. So we have the Ds, and the Ds gives us dispersal rates that give us a measure of how far the population kind of disperses per time period. We have the A's, which are growth rates, which gives us the growth of the population per time period. And then we have the shift parameters, which gives us the strength of the shift, between those different populations. So what we did was, here we go, the Ds were estimated on the base of marriage distances. So you get data on on marriage distance for a woman in Scotland. I think it's the birthplace and then the place where she gets married, and that apparently is an okay proxy for population dispersal. The A's are pretty simple. That is that is just taken out of the census. It's kind of birth minus death processes. So that's, and we get in trouble with the C's, because the C's are our switching terms. They, amongst others, capture social status. So, and they capture, but a lot of more things. So they capture attitudes of a population learning this language. They capture all sorts of things, and we all combine that in one little tiny number or one little parameter. And there was no way we could estimate that from external data. So what we did was basically having those D's, having those A's, and then just ask what's the best fit to the data. Which C's, which switching rates do we obtain, or for which C's do we get the best fit to the data? So, and then I went to my linguist friends and tell them, look, that is the estimates I get. I don't want to get an answer for you whether that's right or wrong, but am I on the right track? Is the relation okay? And they were saying, well, nothing where we would, what we could sign, but the relation of, let's say, 1/4 to 1/3 to 2 to 2/3 might be roughly right. So that's what we did. These externally, and these fitted to data with kind of linguistic approval that it might not be completely out of proportion of how those languages would relate status-wise.
I have a question about the demographic transition and how that process. So, given the importance of intergenerational transmission of these languages, whether you think, first of all, I guess this process is going to be more severe in places where the demographic transition is further along. And also, if there, I would guess there are often differences in the fertility rates of minority versus majority groups, right? And so does that give maybe a hopeful sign in that I would guess fertility rates are usually higher in the minority groups, and could that counterbalance?
Oh, definitely. So what the little movies I showed you is basically where we just vary the dispersal rates. What we haven't increased is actually what we haven't played around is with reproduction rates. However, we did those analyses and the trend is very clear. Basically, if you can replace people who migrate away quickly enough, then you have an advantage. So yes, actually reproduction rate has a huge effect. If there is an imbalance between these two populations, that can also influence the course of things dramatically.
I just had a thought about your model having only monomorphic equilibria. And it seems like one way to have polymorphic equilibria would be if you had some sort of negative frequency dependent
Exactly.
things. And I was thinking, I mean, I'm sure you've thought about this, but if you modeled it as opposed to discrete languages, if you modeled it as dialects, that could vary in similarities.
Yeah.
You know, then you might get negative frequency dependent effects where the farther that you go from where you are and try to speak the language, the more difficult it is to be understood.
I see. Yeah.
Right? Because I mean, you wonder if it's true that these models, as they stand, only lead to monomorphic equilibria. Why there's language diversity in the world at all? You'd think that there must be some other processes
Exactly. And
that are not captured that are maintaining the diversity.
And what you're suggesting is completely right. If we actually allow those parameters to be frequency dependent, let's say something like, well, if it's too low, I'm stick up for it, then I will speak it. You of course get beautiful coexistence. Right. So all those additional, that is a very basic setup, just based on status and frequency. All other kind of processes you could envision can be built in, and they have they have dramatic consequences. Such an anti-conformity, what you mentioned,
I was thinking also. I mean, that makes sense, but I was thinking also sort of communicative efficiency.
Okay, I see. Yes.
As you travel across the U.S., you know, people understand you best.
Where
you are, and then 100 miles away. There's different dialects.
No, exactly.
And it's a continuous thing, so that would mean that's going to maintain local.
That's. I mean, that's the idea of having kind of local core areas of a dialect or of a language, and of course, if I have those, that would mean that in these local core area, those shift coefficients might be different than in other local areas. So basically, the Cs are space dependent, and yes, you can include that, and you get beautiful coexistence if you allow for this kind of spatial heterogeneity. That's something. Especially something what we did was it was a very toy example. It's a situation in Canada where you have kind of French in kind of the Quebec area and English in the other area, and that's exactly the way we modeled. We just assumed that the core area of the French language is kind of the Quebec area, where you had one set of parameters, and then the English area was, I mean, all the rest, where we had a different set of parameters. What you get was beautiful coexistence with a nice kind of bilingual strip, which fitted data kind of okay, but it was a toy experiment which just showed that making that spatial dependent gives you exactly those processes. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So I have questions that arise from Chris's and Clark's questions. So one is, isn't it possible that, I thought this is where you were going, that status is not just relative to one another in having the trait, but that there's negative status associated with having the trait, so that the bilinguals don't actually just acquire the status of the higher status language because they still retain the lower status language.
Oh, I see. Yes.
And with that may just make it harder for the low status language, and it doesn't change the dynamics. But maybe do you think it would change the dynamics if still having the trait is negative?
Well, in that case, you would distinguish between you would basically give population groups a certain status. You have like the bilingual population then having a different kind of status than the other ones.
I guess so.
And that's kind of something we wanted to avoid. We wanted just to have the status variable as a like attribute of the language itself. But I think it's very valid comment that the bilingual strategy might be actually the one which gives you the highest status, because you can actually communicate in both, and that might give you a huge advantage. So in order to capture that, you would basically, you had basically 3 status variables. What would be actually a very interesting exercise to do.
I think both of our contexts where we work actually has the opposite effect of it in being intermediate. So even though you can speak Spanish, the fact that you still speak Quechua, Shuar, Aymara is still bad.
Okay.
So but it is true. I mean, it's an interesting dynamic to see if it has additive effects or intermediate effects.
It's a very interesting suggestion.
And then in terms of these parameters of intrinsic growth, is that a certain point in time, or
sorry, I didn't
to get the actual values from census data, like intrinsic growth and spatial dispersal? Is that census data from a particular point in time, or how
Well,
do you do it for?
so for the age, we have it basically every 10 years.
So
So
it does change. The
that-
state does change.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's something we kind of updated,
Okay.
and here we have it, I think, updated 3 times because we just don't have more data. So, and the census doesn't really ask those questions anymore. It started, but then it kind of asks the question kind of differently. So we couldn't trace these birthplace and place where the women get married that nicely anymore. So it's updated like 3 times over time. Ideally, we would like to have it, of course, also in the 10-year period, but we just don't have the data for it.
So you could do something like make up data, or
Yeah.
assume different growth values and then look at what.
Yeah, exactly. That's
to deal with the demographic transition.
That's definitely what we could do.
It seems to me you're dealing with a really severe contact situation. You've got Scots Gaelic, or Scottish Gaelic, facing off against the global lingua franca. Now, if it was the Scottish Gaelic against another Gaelic, there might be a different thing going on. Now, you may be familiar with the book, The Last Lingua Franca by Nicholas Ostler, came out in 2010. Kind of a fascinating piece. And in the end, he has this scenario that I don't imagine could ever come about. But he thinks that voice recognition technology is getting so good that eventually we will have no lingua franca.
Okay.
Because you could maintain the Gaelic speakers by fixing them with some translation device so that whenever they hear English, or English is spoken to them, they hear Gaelic. Now, right now, you have to know something about the target language to make this work. He doesn't. He's a linguist, knows 46 languages, blah, blah, blah. But he's able to play with the languages. So if this were to come about, you can imagine what foreign language education would be like, say, at a place like UCLA. They wouldn't be teaching you foreign languages, they'd be teaching you how to use the technology. Now, if that kind of cultural change takes place, people could hang on to their language and deal with, I think probably in the face of a powerful language like English, they'd have to learn it because you cannot, this is what you can't say about a Dutch person. You can't say that he's a highly educated Dutch person but can't speak any English. That's an oxymoron. So chances are if there is a global high prestige language, you're going to have to learn that. But with other language context situations, this might be able to be worked out through technology and some knowledge of the target language.
Well, if they haven't died out till then, that would be a wonderful idea.
I think this points out why the lingua franca isn't the main reason that the languages are being lost. Because if you the technology for having an automatic translation device for any language is kind of reasonable, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you keep your language. And the reason I would say that is because the dialects are still there within Gaelic. There's variation within English, and that's what's being acted on in cases where there's not a question of mutual intelligibility, but there is loss of the dialect. So there is vanishing, as a paper on a vanishing dialect of English in the like Ocracoke Island in North Carolina, and this is it's mutually intelligible. It's totally just very similar to how I'm speaking now in most respects from a linguistic point of view, but it's totally going away because of all these social factors about prestige and stuff like that. So being unable to understand is only a small part of the motivation here for losing the language, and being a lingua franca is only one part of it, maybe a big part of why some languages have prestige. And I think it would be interesting if you continue to work on this matter to look at the dialect diversity, in Gaelic, but in Scots, different kinds of Scots that have different prestige, or certainly different kinds of English. As we're all no doubt familiar with in the United Kingdom, that have different prestige, that are fully English, not Scots English. but that have, and so like if you shift from Gaelic into English, which English do you shift into? And how is that then looked at? And you know, and this is like a lot of comments and not very much question, but like, you know, makes me think like, you know, you shift into English, but do you shift into an English that still is sort of marginalized and still is sort of endangered because of that low status?
Yeah, yeah. So you tap in a very, very true area that I think the major shortcoming this modeling exercise has is that language don't evolve. So you have an A and you have a B and you have an AB. So, but that's the the three states we have. And of course, the very next step one should take this exercise is actually letting languages evolve. But having said that, then we can forget about all those things. Then we kind of need a new modeling approach. However, it is, I think, for understanding the whole process better, it's exactly the way one should go. So I couldn't agree more.
I'd like to understand a bit better how you get such a very fine agreement between data and your model. Now, you have here 6 parameters which are free. Is this correct?
So yes. So I should show you the. Show it again.
What is the time? I cannot read the time.
Oh, sorry. That is 1900 and that is 2000.
So television and other things which.
Sorry, say it again.
They're things
Television,
in your
okay.
model, like television. They're not in the model.
No.
And
It's basically just really shift dynamic based on frequencies and kind of the notion of status. So, and what I said before is we have basically 2 or 4 free parameters which we have to estimate from data because I didn't find a way of estimate them from external sources. So, and of course it's always the question, the more free parameter you have, the better the fit of your model. So if you look at these dotted lines, that's like here, which are a little bit more off. So that are the cases where we only estimated 2 parameters. So we have, so let me start again. We have 12 time points where we have the frequencies of monolingual Gaelic, monolingual English, and bilingual. So we have 12 of those time periods where we can calibrate our model to. So, and free parameters are 2 or 4, and with the more parsimonious estimations, you see in these these dotted lines, I think it's not very obvious. It has a little bit of a problem with getting the S shape, or the R shape. However, it gets the trend pretty well. So, and what I mean with like 4 different models, is you basically assume that this C is the same. This C is the same as this C. So basically, what comes in here gets out with the same strengths. So if we do that, we get already a pretty convincing fit. It's we don't get it properly right, but we did get the trend actually fairly well. So if we allow for those things actually to vary, not surprisingly, we get a better fit. But this fit is now able to kind of follow actually quite nicely this S-shaped curve. And having said that, we also have to be honest. Sorry, wrong direction. Those curves are actually very, very nice for every fitting exercise because they are S-shaped. And I think there are thousands of models out there who can fit S-shaped curves. So if they would be a little bit different, well, it would be interesting to see how well the model does then. But I'm pretty, I pretty like it that with 2 free parameters and 12 times 3 kind of data points we actually have, we get an okay fit of our model to the data. But I share your concern. Yes.
So I'm surprised. And there's a moment in time when television was introduced, the internet, right?
Yeah.
And I would have guessed that we would see in the data some transition there.
What would you expect? Would you expect English to increase faster? Yeah.
I would have expected. Maybe that's naive, but
Well, okay, what I think is happening is that I think we have lost monolingual Gaelic almost completely. So what we have left, or what we are left with, is a small fraction of bilingual individuals. So, and those bilingual individuals, they will speak Gaelic for a reason. For there is something why they want to continue speaking their Gaelic language. It's probably, let's call them the hardcore Gaelic speakers. So they feel they are close to that, and also to their culture. And so I'm not too surprised that perhaps television has not such an impact on those populations.
But
Yeah.
what you just said, is this your model? Or, I mean, the reason that you just explained to us right now,
That
the hardcore people who love their language, that's not the model.
no. The model, what the model assumes, is constant parameters over, or I mean, with the adjustment of the growth rates and the diffusion rates, and these switch parameters are constant over time. So, and that means that actually the shift behavior hasn't changed. So that's something what comes out. We are able to estimate or to fit a constant to the model, which hasn't changed, meaning also that the shift behavior kind of hasn't changed over time. So that's kind of in the model. If you would actually get a very bad fit, that would probably point pretty much to something you just suggested. Yeah. Thank you.
So we're out of time. But let's make, yeah.